Hey folks, didn't see you there. Oh, let me take this off. That's better. Hey folks, I'm Gino the Painting Acolyte, and today we're going to talk about something that has been absolutely driving me insane lately. Improper safety. Yeah, this is a giant rant about safety in our hobby. I know it's kind of like a dad rant to have, but I feel like it's my responsibility as your internet hobby friend to complain to you and hope that you make some better safety choices, if you are making improper safety choices. If you're not, well, sorry, I guess. Tune in next time. Look, our hobby is a really safe one, especially in comparison to a lot of other hobbies that you could be interested in. All things considered, miniature painting is probably one of the least dangerous things you can do with your free time. The thing about that, though, is that the precautions you can take to make this hobby safer are so simple and easy and obvious that it kind of boggles my mind that people don't take the proper safety precautions when they can. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that I'm not a doctor or a scientist or a health specialist or any sort of expert about any of the stuff that I'm going to be ranting about, but it all seems pretty obvious, so if you don't take my word for it, do your own research, but everything I'm going to be talking about I've kind of seen and learned and gathered from the internet over time. Now, when I start talking about improper safety, you might think I might be talking about like knife safety with like cleaning models and stuff like that, and I'm not even really going to be talking about that too much because we use very sharp knives in this hobby a lot, you know, cleaning models and like getting mold lines and model prep and that kind of stuff. But I feel like the manners in which we use them are pretty controlled and precise and directed, so I feel like people don't have a lot of issues with knife safety. It's also just kind of a more obvious thing that people grow up with, I think. Nevertheless, I feel like it's important for me to say, choke up in your blade and use like controlled, direct, careful movements and don't cut towards yourself. Just don't put yourself in a place where you're going to be able to stab yourself with a sharp hobby knife. That's a big no-no. The main thing that I'm going to be talking about in this video today is airbrush safety. Airbrush unsafety is probably the most prevalent thing I see on the internet regarding our hobby, and it just absolutely drives me up a wall every time I see someone being unsafe with their airbrush. Now, something like 3D printing safety is probably the most important and most, like, unsafe aspect of this hobby that you can get into, but I don't really want to get into that because that's a whole giant can of worms. I don't have a 3D printer, but I've seen people being very unsafe with them. So if you're interested in 3D printing, or you are 3D printing, or you're thinking of getting one, please do a lot of research on resin printer safety. Trust me, your cheap warhammer proxies are not worth carcinoma in your young age. I promise. So the thing about airbrush safety that drives me the most nuts, that I see the least of online, is just very basic using a mask, using a respirator when you're airbrushing. People using their airbrushes indoors without any kind of ventilation right at their painting desk and not wearing a respirator. It drives me insane. Sure, airbrushes have a pretty direct and controlled flow, and unless you're doing something really weird, you're not really going to be like spraying towards your face or your eyes or your lungs or anything like that. But just because the spray from an airbrush isn't going directly towards you doesn't mean that it's something that is completely banal and safe and that you don't need to be worried about whatsoever. That spray, the paint and everything that you're spraying out of your airbrush, it stays in the air, especially if you don't have any kind of ventilation pulling it out of the room that you're in, if you're doing it indoors. If you're not ventilating things, you've got aerosolized paint hanging around in your air, sticking to all the various things in your space, which is unclean and, you know, makes things messy, and is also not safe or good for you. And even with a vent, it's not going to catch absolutely everything, because unless it's like as strong as a vacuum that's just pulling absolutely all the air out of your workspace. Even with a vent hood or some kind of ventilation system that you've got set up, you could still be breathing in paint every single time you pull back on that airbrush trigger if you're not wearing a properly rated respirator. But Gino the Painting Acolyte, you might be saying, miniature paint is non-toxic. That means it's okay and totally fine for you and there's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. Well, hypothetical viewer that I'm making into a straw man, I've got bad news for you on that front. Firstly, not all paint that you might be using is non-toxic. If you're using things like enamels or oil paints or some of the special like different paint effects that you can use through an airbrush or just any kind of paint in general, if you're using artist grade paints as well, there can be some really, really nasty stuff in there that is definitely toxic and isn't considered non-toxic. Cadmium yellow, for instance, in a lot of like fancy artist paints contains cadmium, which is a very toxic substance that can lead to stuff like kidney disease and cardiovascular disease and all kinds of stuff like that. Now, this cadmium yellow hue doesn't actually have cadmium in it. I looked up the pigment, but a lot of like really fancy artist paints that you might like see some of the like super high-skilled painters on YouTube use could have toxic substances in them that you really don't want to ingest. Also, I hate to break it to you, but non-toxic doesn't mean that something is completely danger-free and you're free from harm from it in any sort of way. Legally, non-toxic means that a substance cannot poison, disable, or kill you if someone is exposed to it. That's it. It doesn't mean that it's perfectly safe to just chow down on your favorite unopened bottle of Blood for the Blood God. Miniature paint is primarily acrylic, which means it's made out of a whole lot of different stuff and mediums and substances and all kind of stuff. But primarily, it's made out of plastic. When you use an airbrush, the paint in the cup mixes with the air through the airbrush into a fine mist that it sprays out of the airbrush nozzle. What that means is you've essentially got tons of tiny plastic specks floating around in your air. And when you breathe that air in, you get plastic particles inside your airways and your lungs. Plastic sticks around. It's one of like the biggest things about plastic. When you ingest plastic, it stays inside you, potentially forever. What can that cause? I mean, I don't know. I'm not a doctor. There's not a whole lot of research on specifically like, oh, what happens if you airbrush paint directly into your mouth kind of thing. But it seems obvious to think that you don't want to be ingesting plastic, that you want to be, minimizing that as much as you possibly can. Being able to breathe well is pretty important, and I think that the trade-off of spending a little bit of money and dealing with the hassle of having some ventilation for your airbrush and putting on a proper respirator when you're airbrushing or something like that, I think that that's a very good trade-off to be making for your long-term health. This goes especially if you're using like spray paint primers or varnishes or anything that you might be using that comes out of a spray can. You absolutely should be wearing a respirator for that, and you absolutely should have a lot of airflow and ventilation. Definitely shouldn't be doing it inside, but even outside you want to wear a mask. Those spray cans usually contain some kind of petroleum product that like helps aerosolize the paint and propel it out of the spray can, and that stuff is really nasty. Not only does it smell really bad, but it's really not good for you. You really don't want that stuff in your lungs. You should also wear gloves if you're airbrushing or spray painting or doing something where you end up getting a lot of paint on your hand. I know some people like to wick the paint of their brushes off on their hands. You should wear gloves in situations like that. Your skin is super absorbent. That's one of its main functions, as your skin, is that it's very absorbent. It pulls what it gets on it into your body. When you get paint on your skin absorbs that stuff into your body. Now, it's probably only really absorbing the moisture and that kind of stuff into your body, and overall, it's probably not a big deal or the worst thing that can happen to you to get acrylic paint on your skin, but why take the chance, Slap a glove on when you're doing airbrushing. There's no reason really not to. The importance of wearing gloves is even more prevalent when you're using some of the harsher things that you could be using in our hobby. Stuff like enamel paints or oil paints, mineral spirits that you use with those, some of the kookier effect paints that you can use, isopropyl alcohol for cleaning or other chemicals that you use to strip paint, clean your airbrush or anything like that. There are lots of things that you can use in this hobby that you definitely do not want to be getting on your skin. So, gloves to protect your hands, and an apron, long sleeve shirt, something like that. If you're using some really nasty chemicals, which you probably shouldn't be, but in case, minimize the chance of things getting onto your body. You also want to wear a mask when you're cleaning resin. By that I mean if you've got a resin model, whether it's 3D printed or it's made in the traditional way of a resin cast or something like that. If you're handling that model and preparing it, you want to be wearing a mask, because resin dust is really nasty and a lot worse and harsher than your regular plastic like dust from your regular models. So when you're sanding or cutting or like prepping resin models, you probably want to be wearing a mask. Maybe not like a respirator like this, but something that protects you from dust getting into your mouth. If you're doing like a lot of sanding and prep on like big models, like if you've got like a big terrain project going on and you're sanding like kilograms of plastic all at once, you probably want to be wearing a mask at the same time for that too. Look, I know that I'm being preachy and annoying. I know that this is a very safe hobby, and I know that you're probably going to be fine if you're not taking all of the safety precautions you could be taking. There's always going to be more things that you can do to, stay safe, and it's probably okay in a hobby like this if you're not doing absolutely everything. And I also don't mean to like call anyone out or make anyone feel like they're targeted if I'm, harping on things that you do. It's your life and it's your hobby, and you're free to do with it whatever you want. I just think it's important to keep safety in mind when you be doing things that could be unsafe. The kind of things that you can be doing to take care of yourself and keep healthy in regards to this hobby are really simple and easy to do, and I think that it's worth taking the time to do them. You only get one life, and I really don't think it's worth the risk of potential health issues down the line just because you couldn't be bothered to wear a mask when you're doing some airbrushing. Anyway, that's it for today. If you've got any other kind of safety advice that you'd like to suggest, anything that I might have missed, or if you just want to call me a lame narc, go ahead and do that down in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something or got something out of it or just find it entertaining or something. It means a lot to me that you've watched. Until next time, I'm Gina the Painting Acolyte. Take care, and bye-bye.